Hi, sixth graders. Today we're going to be talking about climate. Um, Hopefully, you have a better understanding of weather now that you understand it's looking at the conditions in the atmosphere. Climate is similar to weather, but is different in some really important ways. We're going to discuss those today. First thing to talk about is that climate is a system. And like we talked about in our last project, a system means it's a lot of individual pieces working together. So climate depends on some of the things you learned about in weather, depends on temperature, humidity, clouds, wind speed, air pressure. But it also depends on the oceans and where they are. It depends on the land and where mountains are. It depends on the living things on Earth, like the plants and the animals. So all these things work together to create the climates that we have. We're going to start by watching a little video. In the video, this guy's going to explain the difference between weather and climate.
Weather is what we experience day to day, the conditions that we see in the world when we go outside, whether it's sunny, whether it's rainy, whether it's hot or cold or cloudy. Climate is the long-term average of weather. It's something that we can think of over a whole season, spring, summer, or winter. It's something that we can think of over a whole year or many different years, and it's something that also changes over time. Whenever you have an extreme weather event, like a heat wave or a snowstorm, people think that that might signal a longer-term change in climate, when you really can't say anything about climate from single events like that. In terms of looking at changes in climate, you really need to think about long-term averages and long-term trends. Really, if you want to measure a change in climate, you're talking about changes that are happening over at least 20 to 30 years or longer. My name is Michael Mastrandrea. I work for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. We do scientific research and assess the state of scientific knowledge to inform policy making at the international and also at national levels around the world.
Okay, so like was discussed in the video, weather is looking at the conditions in the atmosphere in the short term. So the time periods we look at for weather are not long, they're short term. So we look at the weather over like a day or a week or a month. When we describe the weather, we use very specific language. There's heavy rain that rained 2 inches, or the temperature was 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So short term, very specific, and that means it's less predictable. We can predict the weather pretty accurately in short periods of time within a day or two, but if we try to predict the weather, a month out or 2 months out, we're not very successful and we don't know exactly what the weather is going to be like. So to summarize, weather is short term, it's very specific, and it's less predictable. Climate, on the other hand, also looks at conditions in the atmosphere, but it looks at the conditions on average for a very long period of time. So it asks, what's the weather like in general in this place over the last 30 years? So that means we look at the weather over a long period of time and then kind of summarize it or talk about what it's like in general. So we use very general language to describe climate. We say it's dry, or it's hot, or it's cold, or it's wet. So if I was going to describe the climate in Sunnyvale in the wintertime, I would say that it is cooler and that it is kind of rainy. It's wet, a wet climate. That's because in general, the temperatures are lower in Sunnyvale in the wintertime, and in general, it rains a lot. Doesn't mean that it rains every day. It doesn't mean that every day is cold, but it just means that in general, that's what the weather is like most of the time. Because we look at averages and we look at general patterns with climate, climate's actually more predictable than weather. Because we know that next year, in general, the winter is going to be, again, cooler and kind of rainy in Sunnyvale. So I can predict that much more accurately than if I tried to predict the weather on a specific day 1 year from now. I could not do that very well, but I could predict the climate pretty well. So again, to summarize, climate looks at patterns over a long term. It uses very general language to describe the conditions, and it's much more predictable. So this graph, we're going to go through this graph to look at the difference between weather and climate. Now I'm going to start by talking about just what I see in the graph and using that to figure out what the graph is telling me. So I can see on the bottom that the space on the bottom represents months, and I see it goes from January to December. So I can see that this is kind of about time and how maybe something is changing over the course of a year. On the left side, the y-axis, I see that the measurements are temperature. So my guess is this graph is looking at the temperature of a place and how that temperature changes over a year. Now there's 4 different lines on the graph. Whoever made this graph was really nice though, and they labeled each line so I know what they're telling me. I can see that the light pink line tells me the daily high temperature. The light blue line tells me the daily low temperature. The dark red line is labeled the average high temperature, and the dark blue line is labeled the average low temperature. So in general, what this is telling me is that they went out and they measured the temperature every single day, wherever they were, and they measured the high temperature every day and the low temperature every day, and they graphed those with these light lines. And that makes sense to me because I know that the temperature can change a lot from day to day. So it makes sense that these lines, I can see these are kind of jagged lines, they jump up and down a lot. But then looking at the dark red and the dark blue lines, those are averages. And I know from math that averages don't change a lot, so it makes sense that these lines would be a bit smoother. The averages don't jump around a lot, they gradually change. So it makes sense that the graph of the average would be a smooth line. So when I look at this graph, I'm going to start to look at kind of the pattern and the shape of it and what that tells me. Like I said, I see the daily temperatures jump around a lot, so that makes a lot of sense to me. Sometimes it's hotter, and the next day could be a lot colder. But I really want to focus on the dark lines here, and I see that in general, the average temperatures are lower in the wintertime. But then as we get to the summer, the average temperatures increase, they climb up, they get hotter. And then again, as we start to get into the fall and into the winter, the average temperatures drop back down again. So I can see that this is a location where, in general, temperatures are lower in the wintertime. And then when we get towards the summer, it gets hot, the temperatures increase. And then when we get back to the winter again, the temperatures drop down again. So now I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to want you to pause the video and discuss it with your team. And the first question is this. Of these lines, which lines do you think represent weather? And which lines do you think represent climate? Please pause the video now and discuss that with your team. Okay, so now that you're back, hopefully you discussed that the daily high and the daily low lines, those jagged lines that jump up and down a lot, those represent weather because those represent a measurement that in the atmosphere that changes a lot from day to day. And it's looking at a short period of time. It's looking at a single day. The solid lines are the lines that would represent climate because those are looking at averages over longer periods of time. And they describe in general what the climate is like in a place in a longer period of time. Now I want you to discuss this question. Again, you'll pause the video to discuss it. What does this graph tell you about the relationship between weather and climate? Pause the video and discuss that now, please. What does this graph show you about the relationship between weather and climate? Okay, so when you probably talked about lots of different things. One thing that this graph tells me about weather and climate is it shows how the daily weather can change a lot from day to day. But in general, it follows these patterns, these general patterns that describe the climate. So like we said, the individual temperatures can change a lot from day to day, but they tend to follow this general pattern of being warmer in the summer and colder in the winter, and that's a description of climate. When we look at climate, we tend to look, like we said, at long periods of time, usually at like 30 years or more to figure out the climate of a place. There's no specific reason for 30 years or more. That's just something that scientists kind of decided, like, this is a long enough period of time to describe the climate of a place. So this graph, you can see this is measuring temperatures over 100 years. So this is a really good way to look at climate and see what happens to the climate of a place. This graph measures the temperature at a certain place over the last 100 years. Now we can see that each black dot represents the average temperature in 1 year in this place. We can see that that jumps around a lot. But the red line kind of is more of our climate graph, and that it kind of looks at the average temperature of this place over a longer period of time. And we can see that the temperature of this place is definitely over time gone up. Now, if we had only looked at the temperature from 1 year to the next, we could maybe say, like, oh my God, that this climate of this place is getting a lot colder from this year to this year. But again, that's why we look at these longer periods of time, because we want to see that in general, the climate's actually in this place getting warmer. Even though the temperature can change a lot from 1 year to the next, we look at these longer patterns to see how things are changing. Climate is important because it determines lots of the actions we take every single day. It determines our long-term decisions, like where we live or where we work. And that can also affect where plants and animals live.